going to see very, very few landings. And I said, well, let me go through the files and I'll show you some landings. The reason they didn't show up was that they were all explained as aberrations or hallucinations. But you would find very credible witnesses and you would find traces. And the thing that clinched it was the case in Socorro, New Mexico. In Socorro, not only was there a landing, there were beings.
Socorro, New Mexico, April 24th, 1964, 5:45 p.m. While chasing a speeding car, Police Sergeant Ronnie Zamora hears a thunderous roar and sees a flame in the sky to the southwest. Thinking a local dynamite shack might have exploded, Zamora leaves the chase to investigate.
When I got up to the window, next to my bed, my full flight tank, empty, looking up to.
Ronnie Zamora sees something. A landed craft, essentially egg-shaped. He sees some figures, and he says afterwards they were either big children or small adults, which again raises the question, were these extraterrestrials, as many believe? Suddenly, when he got reasonably close, they got back in, and this thing took off.
Zamora examined the area with fellow Police Sergeant Sam Chavez. Both officers documented that the brush was burning in several places, and the object had left 4 perpendicular impressions on the ground. Dozens of other investigators arrived on the scene shortly after the incident, and in the days that followed.
You had actually 4 levels of investigation. You had the Socorro cops, you had the FBI that happened to be there, you had the security detail from the airfield, you had special investigations with the Air Force sending Dr. Hynek, and that became part of Project Blue Book, as unidentified by all the investigators who had been there.
I certainly believe that Zamora had a most interesting and significant experience, and I'm particularly interested in the tracks that were left, the analysis of the samples of material from those tracks. The material, if you know more about it, all I can say that is disappointing to you, perhaps, in some big way, I was supposed to do.
Jacques told me that it was this case that was more or less the straw that broke the camel's back that made my father feel comfortable speaking about beings as opposed to just craft in public.
It was a difficult transition for Dr. Hynek to admit that, yes, not only were language important, but they were the greatest source of actual physical data that you could take to the lab.
For Jean Fillet, collecting data is the key to solving the UFO mystery. As part of his effort to create a global UFO database, Fillet, with the help from Dr. Hynek, began building an international network of scientists investigating the phenomena. They called themselves the Invisible College, taking the name from a group of 18th century European scholars.
This was similar to what happened in the 18th century, a great invisible college, and they did a lot of early astronomy, early physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And the reason they were not hung or killed as witches was because they were protected by the king. Dr. Hynek thought we were some of the new iteration of the Invisible College. People like Gustave Beauregard in France, like Professor Chauvin in France, were internationally known in their fields, biology, relativity, and so on. But they were very interested in talking about UFOs with us. Of course, this was very secret.
The Invisible College began in Dr. Hynek's home, where weekly or monthly he would have scientists from all around the world visit his house, and there they would discuss the UFO topic. But they all were sworn to secrecy because at the time you couldn't talk about it in seriousness, especially in the world of academia. Although most members of the Invisible College remained anonymous, Jacques Vallée did not. And in 1965, he published Anatomy of a Phenomenon, one of the earliest books written about the UFO subject by a scientist.
Anatomy of a Phenomenon was a very, very strong compilation of these UFO reports at that time. He's looking at the data, organizing it, and really made his name in the UFO field.
But as Vallée was forging his reputation in the field of ufology, the U.S. government was looking for a way to end its UFO investigations. In 1966, the so-called Condon Committee, led by physicist Edward Condon, was commissioned by the U.S. Air Force to assess whether to continue funding studies like Project Blue Book.
Their job supposedly was to make the determination scientifically. Is this real? Is this not real? What should the Air Force do? Should the Air Force drop Project Blue Book? And the answer is nothing to it. It's not worthy of further scientific investigation.
When the Condon study began, it became obvious that it was rigged to give a negative conclusion. I didn't want to stay in the US under those conditions. I thought if that's what science is in America, we don't belong in America.
After a disappointing end to his time at Project Blue Book, Jacques Vallée moved back to Paris with his wife and son. But as backlash against UFO research spread in the public sphere of science and academics, Jacques Vallée would develop his most profound UFO theory yet, that aliens have always been among us. Paris, May 1968. 30-year-old Jacques Vallée is working as an engineer for the Royal Dutch Shell Oil and Gas Company when civil unrest erupts throughout France. Triggered by a series of student protests against capitalism and consumerism, the unrest leads to a nationwide strike.
Essentially, there were 3 months during which no work was done. So I could go back to my own research interests full time. I collected a number of books in areas that I had wanted to look at for a long time. And the question, which is really a scientific question, is, so we have UFOs and UFO waves. When did that really start?
Vallée discovered that accounts of mysterious objects in the sky weren't limited to contemporary reports. In fact, the more he dove into the origins of the UFO phenomenon, the further back in time he went.
There was a lot of literature from the Muslim world about jinn and about other creatures created by God, along with men and animals. So I started looking at this, and what dawned on me was that you could go back in history, and people would interpret it in religious terms as either evil or angels or religious apparitions.
Jacques Vallée noticed some connections between modern-day UFO sightings and ancient folkloric tales of strange lights and even entity encounters. And he said, look, this could be the same phenomenon, but just people use different words according to their language, according to their belief systems.
I looked especially in Europe, so many of those were fairy tales that I had heard as a kid. It turns out they come from real observations with a few folklore experts in the 19th century and early 20th century in Ireland and Wales Scotland, had gone around collecting actual reports of people encountering not just little people, but little people with strange contraptions, strange houses where you would lose your sense of time, you would come out and years would have passed, and so you're beginning to see that these people were confronted with another race, that there was communication with it.
Jacques Vallée realized that many of the stories that we have in the Middle Ages of trolls and fairy folk and things like that, it reminded him of similar stories that we have today in the UFO world. So he asked the question, is it possible that these ancient stories that we have, are they identical to what we see with the modern day UFO phenomenon? In 1969, Jacques Vallée published the culmination of this research in a book titled Passport to Magonia, named for the fabled cloud realm detailed in medieval French folklore. In that book, he describes that perhaps some of those old stories and legends of fairy folk are not necessarily made up, but that they may be descriptions of visiting extraterrestrials that our ancestors then interpreted as fairy folk.
Passport to Magonia was a game changer to suggest that these things, whatever they are, interact with humans throughout human history on every continent, in every culture.
At this time, the primary thought about extraterrestrials was UFOs only started showing up in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting, but Vallée is starting to see that they've always been here.